in-person. Indeed it is. That's why I was worried about the microphone. And a warm welcome to this in-person briefing organized by the European Policy Center in the aftermath of the 2024 elections to the European Parliament. I'm very grateful to see that so many of you have braved to join our expert discussion today about the results that have transpired from the voting marathon that unfolded in all 27 member states over the past few days. Across the EU, citizens have now cast European, but also in many instances, local, regional, or national ballots in the world's largest or biggest transnational democratic exercise. These are the first elections taking place after Brexit, and also they are the first elections after a series of very powerful crises that have shaken up European societies and European politics, but also indeed the global international order. Little surprise then that in the run-up to these elections, we've all been warned that they would be historic and that they would be a game changer for European liberal democracy, but also European policy making. So, have these predictions been correct? Was the democracy doom hype justified? To help us make sense of the outcome and also of its potential implications, I have a remarkable panel lined up, including speakers like Catherine Fieschi, who is now a visiting fellow at the European University Institute, but also the author of Populacracy. I mentioned one book among many other important contributions that she has made, and which remains for me, and I'm sure for many others, a reference when it comes to understanding the radical populist vote and success. She will be joining us today remotely. Catherine, I hope you can hear us. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
And then with all of us here in the room, I have my dear colleagues, Fabian Zuleeg, who is Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, who is Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the EPC. Thank you very much to all three of you for agreeing to do this today and join our conversation. I will first discuss the elections with you on the panel, and then I will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And in order to make the most out of our limited time together today, let's delve straight in. And I would like to start from a general mapping of the first impressions of the outcome. And for that, I'll probably turn first to Janis. Janis, I want to ask you about your headline impressions of the results, if you can give them to us to kick off the conversation.
Sure, I'm happy to do so, and good welcome also from my behalf. It's nice to see you all in the room. You asked whether the elections were or are historic, and I would probably say from today's perspective, probably not. However, we know from history that things develop after major events, so you never know how historic they might be. And I'm sure that we will be discussing the fact that there will be elections in France triggered by the election results of yesterday, which actually could eventually lead to these elections being historic. But we'll discuss that. So let me share 5 main takeaways from the EP elections, from the results, making a step back, meaning that there will probably also be some things which we all know, but it's good to put ourselves all on the same page. The first takeaway, I think, which is probably the most obvious, is that, as many had expected, by the way, the majority of mainstream parties did hold, but it is numerically weakened, given to the losses which both the Liberals and the Greens have suffered. There is a clear relative majority for the EPP. maybe they done even better than some had assumed before the elections. The Social Democrats are more or less where they have been in the last European Parliament. But then there are the relative losses of the Liberals, but especially the Greens, where the result in Germany was probably the most devastating for the Greens. But by the way, if you look into other member states, especially Nordic countries, you will see that the Greens done well, which I think is one sub takeaway of these elections, that there are mixed signals coming from the different member states, from the 27 parallel elections which we had witnessed. But by the way, the Greens could still be able to play a prominent role because they're needed. They're needed especially for Commission President von der Leyen to be re-elective, which obviously is her biggest concern. Takeaway number two, the far right parties have been strengthened along the lines of longer term trends. That is worrisome. If a quarter of the European Parliament is made up of far right, of representatives from far right parties, that obviously is something which is a major source of concern. But it has not led to the political earthquake, which some were suggested we might be witnessing in the European Parliament. By the way, we still need to see how things will develop with respect to where Fidesz will align itself, what will happen to the AfD. So there are also a good number of questions when it comes to the far right parties. But I think in the European Parliament, it's not an earthquake, but it is an earthquake in a good number of member states. I already mentioned France, obviously with the result of Rassemblement National, with the elections being called, that is a political earthquake with potentially also consequences at the European level. I'll come back to that in a second. We have an Alternative for Deutschland that did very well in Germany. However, their result could have been even better if some of the things that happened in the weeks and months ahead of the elections in Germany would not have happened. But they did very well, and did very well, by the way, in Eastern Germany, but also Austria. If you see the results for the FPÖ being party number one in Austria some years ago, after the scandals, many probably would not have thought that that would be happening now, but it did. So in many good number of member states, they have done well, but in other member states, they have done less well than many had expected. Look into Poland, look into Hungary, look into Sweden, look into Finland. So again, a mixed sign also coming from the member state. Takeaway number three, I think the biggest effects of the EP elections are the effects of the election results, are the effects of election results at the national level, both with respect to the effects on national politics. France is the most significant case, but also the effects on national EU policy making. Let me just give you an example, and I think that's also important if we look into the EU dimension of the results in a good number of member states, meaning what potential effect might it have when it comes to setting political priorities at the European level, implementing them at the European level, but also potentially to debate about EU reforms. On all these things, you need to have strong member states, strong political will coming from national capitals, and you clearly would also need, to give an example, the Weimar Triangle. Donald Tusk and his party did very well in the EP elections, better than some had maybe expected. But Macron is very much weakened. The German government, coalition government, is extremely weakened. All three parties, but especially the Socialists and the Greens, have done poorly in these EP elections. So you have weakened governments in Paris, in Berlin. That is bad news from the perspective of us hoping that at European level you will have a high level of aspiration, ambition when it comes to setting political priorities, and also with respect to implementing them. The fourth takeaway relates to turnout. We do not know exactly what the turnout is or has been. What we know, and what the European Parliament already shared last night, was that it will be roughly at the level of 2019. So if it is above 50%, slightly above 50%, that is good news. However, the expectations were much higher, given the Eurobarometer results over the past months indicating that a lot of European citizens felt that these EP elections were important. Now, even if this number was around 70%, nobody was assuming that the turnout would be at 70%. But the fact that it was not higher than it was 5 years ago, I think is something which is worthwhile mentioning, considering the fact that we're facing all the challenges which we're facing at the European level and at the national level. So a lot at stake, but still the turnout at the same level, more or less, it seems, than it was 5 years ago. And I think that that has also to do with the fact that we actually did not have in the election campaigns, in the national election campaigns, but even to a certain extent at the European level, we did not have an honest debate about strategic questions about the future of the continent. We did not have debates, honest debates about those things that we are challenged with and potentially the consequences of the challenges which we're facing, whether it has to do with the poly transition, whether it has to do with geopolitical, geoeconomic developments. We did not have that sincere debate. And I think that this was something which was done on purpose, because there are fear among mainstream parties that if you would have had these debates, it potentially could have played into the hands, or even more into the hands, of the far right. And my last takeaway is that obviously now at the EU level, the game starts. The political game starts in terms of what all this means with respect to putting together the next EU leadership, in defining the key political priorities, putting together the next commission. So the selection or election process of the EU leadership process is now actually moving into its hot phase, with the puzzle starting with the commission president. I think that the election results have increased the chances that Ursula von der Leyen will get a second mandate. The EPP, as I said earlier, did relatively well. The Liberals, and thus also President Macron, have been weakened because there was a discussion as to whether how much support would be coming from him in Paris to Ursula von der Leyen. There's a question of what effect the snap elections in France, the parliamentary elections, might have on the timetable. My assumption is that the timetable, which says that there will be a decision of the European Council who to nominate as next Commission President, will not change. That is scheduled for end of the month, for the European Council meeting 27th, 28th of June. So I think chances are high that she will get a nomination, but then she has to persuade, she has to secure strong support in the European Parliament, which means she also needs to secure not also support among her own rows, where there are also some question marks, but also among other parts of the mainstream parties. She needs to secure a comfortable majority, because numerically it is a secret ballot for the president-elect. There is a chance that support for her will not be fully among even those parties supporting her. Some say she might lose 10 or 20%. I'm sure we want to discuss that in the discussion. So she needs, for the 361 votes she requires in the European Parliament, a strong majority in the European Parliament behind her. Putting this together will not be an easy thing to do, but I think that there is a chance that she will be able to do so. And I think that also the maneuvering with the Fratelli d'Italia, which we saw over the past weeks and months, is an attempt to make sure that the mainstream parties will be more supportive of her. Let's see. So from today's perspective, that's where I end. I think the safest bet, although it is a very unsecure bet, is that one can assume that the EPP will get the Commission presidency. Von der Leyen's chances being very strong, that the socialists will want to go for the European Council presidency, contrary to what they did last time around. It seems that Costa has a good chance for that, if you talk to people close to the members of the European Council, and that leaves the Liberals with the position of HRVP. But that is my call in terms of what might happen with respect to the EU leadership. My main takeaways, and I'm sure that there's a lot to discuss.
Great. Thank you so much, Janis, for laying the ground for us to have to go more into that about these different issues, all very important insights. But listening to you, I cannot help thinking that at the end of the day, what you've painted is a picture of relative stability. Despite some changes and some dynamics, at the end of the day, when you look at the structure of the parliament, when you look at how different trends have been reinforced, it's more of the same, isn't it? Fabian, how do you feel about that? Has this heralded a real change? And what, if anything, has surprised you personally from these elections?
I'm not sure surprised is the right word, maybe depressed. But let me rephrase your question a little bit. Why do I think this election result is concerning? And just as an interesting side note, when you look at some of the commentary around the world, it seems the closer to the bubble you are, the less you think it is concerning. And I think that tells us something, because it's a question of what are we actually comparing it to? What is the reference point we are saying? Are we comparing it to the opinion polls? If we look at the opinion polls, then yes, it's a much better outcome than we would have feared. A few months ago, it looked more negative. It looked more concerning. So from that perspective, we can say, yes, it didn't turn out as bad as we thought it would. If we look at it in comparison to the parliament we've had and the last election, then it becomes a little bit more mixed, but maybe that's more in the direction of what you were saying, stability or maybe stagnation. Although there are some worrying signs. There is a strengthening of the extremes. There is a weaker majority. I think turnout, we still have to see. I'm not quite sure we're comparing like with like. I think we have to look at the effect, for example, of the UK not being in. We have to look at the effect of 16 and 17-year-olds. So let's see where it really is in comparison. But what we've definitely not seen is an increase, a significant increase, despite the relevance and the importance of the issues which we are facing. And I think that's where I do get more concerned, because what we are seeing is actually a reinforcement of longer term trends. We are seeing a continuing weakening of the center, in line with what is happening at the national level as well, but that doesn't make it any less concerning. We are seeing that there is a very significant negative impact on domestic politics. And we've already mentioned that, particularly in France and Germany, but you also see it in other places. We're seeing, I would argue, a normalization of extremism. It now has become normal that we have these types of parties in very sizable numbers within the parliament. And we are now talking about moderate far right, which seems to be a bit of a contradiction in terms. But also the wider conduct of how elections are functioning, how democracy is functioning, the presence of violence as part of almost every election we're seeing now. The presence of foreign influence, of direct influence on our democratic processes. This has all become normal. And this very, very distinctive, very sizable movement against the establishment, against the way things are usually done, the democratic system as a whole. I think it's also worrying when we compare it to what we need. We are in a world where Europe is at war. Yes, we are not in the front line. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they experience the full force of it. But this should be the moment when people are recognizing that something is happening, that we need Europe. And it's not. It's very clearly not from the results which we are seeing. And that makes me also very concerned for the future, because we're going to need it even more in future. When we're looking at the challenges which are to come, the continuing war against Ukraine, the continuing difficulty in getting support together, the transatlantic, and there we all know what risks we are running. So if we're looking at the world into which we are moving, then what we need more than ever is a functioning European system, a way of translating our general objectives where everyone broadly agrees, at least on the pro-European side, into real action. And this election hasn't helped at all.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for this gloomy reading. Catherine, we need, Fabian says, a functioning EU system. We need more Europe in these times. Are you concerned? And why do you think that we've seen less mobilization and less obvious change than maybe we would have expected, or maybe that we would desire? How do you explain this outcome?
So I think it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves whether or not this was what was expected. If we look at the polls, actually, we weren't far off the polls. And even though there were a few sighs of relief, the fact is that, you know, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy, for example, did even better than expected. She's flirting with 29% and not 26%. As expected. We thought that maybe given comments, as Janis said, made by the AfD, that perhaps this would have dented them a little bit more, but it didn't. They're still on 16%. They're the second party there. So I think that we should be concerned about the results of these elections. There's a couple of things that I think address some of the comments that were just made. One is that I think everyone had predicted a slide to the right in one way or another, whether it was going to be you know, more on the side of identity and democracy or more on the side of ECR, but also an EPP that's perceived as also sliding to the right in terms of the alliances that it potentially is willing to make. So that doesn't come as much of a surprise. But I think that the important thing here is which right. You know, what kind of slide to the right? One obvious thing to say is that I think that there's going to be quite a lot of flux in the upcoming parliament in terms of where some of these parties end up sitting, not just Fidesz, who's non-aligned right now, but actually probably a game of musical chairs, but even potentially something even more radical, you know, the disappearance of one of these parties or the fundamental transformation. And I think that it will reflect something quite fundamental, which is very dangerous because I think we are normalizing it. We're basically saying that there is a kind of radical right that is sovereignist, that is nationalist, that is actually really quite uncooperative if you think of, you know, Law and Justice in Poland. But nevertheless, that we are willing to tolerate in some ways, and we often label as constructive. And so, you know, we put, you know, Meloni's party in that camp, and again, Law and Justice in that camp. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because this idea of separating, you know, as Fabian just said, you know, in a sense, the tolerable extreme right from the intolerable extreme right, it seems to me that, you know, we're already splitting hairs here in a way that is not terribly helpful. But I think it does give us a clue about the general direction, not just of the Parliament and the European institutions, which will also tilt right in terms of the European Council in some respects, right? But I think it also gives us a clue as to where the voters are. And if we look at the surveys and the polls, and we look at what the voters of these radical right, nationalist right parties say they want, it actually is very much a mixed bag. So you have nationalist sovereignist parties attracting voters who are saying things like they want more European defense, right? Which isn't, you know, a particularly obvious proposition. And I think it's important because, just to make a long story short, it tells us, it seems to me, that really what is going to characterize the next legislature is a legislature of transition. I think that we really are embarking on 5 years where actually at the end of these 5 years, we will see something quite different emerge, both domestically, but also, you know, at the next European elections. So it's why it's so hard, I think, to read the tea leaves of this election, is because I really think that we are embarking on a European Parliament of transition, with voters that have, you know, more than usual contradictory demands about Europe. It matters more to them, but they don't like it more. They feel that it's, you know, not actually done enough for them, but their expectations are growing. And all of this, I think, you know, creates a situation where I think fluidity and planning for what it's going to look like is very, very difficult. So I think it's going to be more transformation than business as usual.
Thank you very much, Catherine. One thing that stands out to me when you speak about this volatility of preferences and positions when it comes to voters and citizens is I think of the youth, because recent polls left and right are showing that it's in fact also among the younger generations that we're seeing a growing dissatisfaction and the backlash even against democratic values, but also democracy, and a radicalization, really. And if voters and constituencies are becoming so volatile, then how can policy delivery be ensured? Because many, for instance, in response to the crisis of representative democracy, invoke the need for Europe. And I think we've heard it even last night from von der Leyen, that we need a Europe that delivers. And how can we ensure policy delivery if we don't know what voters want? How can we counter the radicals and the populists if we don't know how to read and how to respond to voters, given that they are so, as you call them, they have such contradictory demands?
So I think I don't want to be saying that voters are irrational necessarily, right? I think that they want things that are unexpected sometimes, given the parties that they sign up for. You know, again, the whole idea of wanting more Europe, but nevertheless, you know, voting for Giorgia Meloni. Now, you can see how you might get there, because Meloni promises a certain kind of Europe. And so that's not necessarily a contradiction. But I think that the important thing here is that if we look at how voters feel about the behavior of the European Union and the so-called wins of the European Union over the past 5 years, they are pretty much insensitive to them, right? They don't see what the wins were, because even if you cite vaccines and you cite the recovery package and the fact that, you know, Europe's at least current unity in terms of Ukraine, all of this that we take as wins, and I think they are wins for most voters. The fact is that life doesn't necessarily feel like it's gotten any easier. And if anything, it feels like it's gotten more difficult. So, you know, the wins don't really register. And just a quick word here on youth. I think we talk a lot about youth radicalizing and, you know, a backlash. I think that one of the things that we see across Europe, and it's not particularly documented yet, but I think we should ask ourselves whether youth don't feel that to some extent they were sacrificed particularly in the COVID crisis. I think there's a sense in terms of the conversation groups and the focus groups that I've done where there's, you know, a real perception on their part that they were thrown under the bus in order to protect others, and that in a sense they haven't got much of a reward for that. And so, you know, there's not a lot of gratitude toward their current governments or toward Europe in that respect. And so they are voting for parties who want a radically different kind of Europe.
Did. Yes, Fabian, I wanted to come to and ask your opinion on this, but also on what you think the impact will be for policy making and for the big decisions that lie ahead and that Janis mentioned at the beginning.
I do want to challenge a bit. I think there is an irrationality, and it's not just an irrationality among voters, it's also among parties of politicians, decision makers. And I think it's a widespread hope, wish that we would live in a different world than in the one we are living in. And that is creating a lot of contradictory responses. Of course, nobody wants to be in a world which is in war, which is where we see living standards declining, where we have cost of living crisis, all of the things which have negatively affected many people around Europe. But unfortunately, that is the reality we are facing. And I think we are going to struggle with democracy. And I'm not talking about the European election here. I'm talking about very generally about liberal democracy. If we cannot convince voters, not only in Europe, but also in America and other places, that this system works in bad times as well as good. How are we going to do that? I don't know. But what we certainly don't have is a leadership which is willing to tell their citizens honestly that some of the choices we are facing in future are going to be costly, are going to be difficult, have very significant trade-offs, will have a very significant impact on people's lifestyles, on the way they conduct their business, but also on the way their children will be living. And I think this is a very, very difficult message. But what does that mean for policy making at the European level? I think we are going to see, unfortunately, more of the same, which is that we're not facing the issues which we ought to be facing, that we're not decisive enough, that we're still having this progress illusion where if we do a little, we hope that it's enough, but the challenges which we are facing are exponential, so they are going up and up. And I know that's a very bleak message, and I'm sorry that I'm still in my doom mood, but I honestly think that what we are going to see is essentially a system which functions even less in producing the kind of outcomes we need. So we have a lot of very important questions in front of us. Some even we don't know yet, but for example, if we do have a Trump presidency, or if we have even worse instability in the US, how is Europe going to respond? We have some concrete issues coming up. The EU budget, a number of decisions around enlargement, for example, and you can make a very long list of these. How are we going to decide that? Are we going to be decisive and say, these are the real costs we're facing, these are the things we're going to do? Or are we going to see more fragmentation, a parliament which effectively is not able to make decisions on the big issues because it is too divided in itself? And again, extending very much to the domestic level. And maybe I'm too pessimistic. We will see. The French election is going to be one of the bellwethers. But I think we are facing a period when really hard and difficult decisions have to be made, but the democratic system is not producing decision-making which is decisive.
Thank you, Fabian. Janis, what is your prognosis about the policy areas that are likely to take a particularly hard hit in the next period? And would you say that some of the topics and the themes and areas that Fabian has underlined and which he called important, maybe some of those, but also others are turning actually into existential issues for the EU. I mean, can we afford to continue to muddle through or to experience stagnation and avoid progressing on all of those hard, difficult, important questions?
No, I don't think that we can afford to muddle through. But analytically, also following the EP elections, the likelihood of us attempting to muddle through or seeing this as the only option or going for the low-hanging fruits, that this is the logic that has been prevailing, and I think that it will continue to prevail. Because at the end of the day, we have still not fully understood the gravity of the moment. So if we would be understanding how radical the change is that is happening around us, the question, I think, would be more concretely addressed as to what we need to do. So my fear is not where will things backfire. There are certain areas, and I think anything that has to do with Green Deal is already and is going to get even more under pressure following the EP elections, as an example. But for me, the bigger question and fear is that we will not be able to define the right level of ambition, that we will not be ready to define what are our main strategic priorities. It was rather going to be a Christmas tree. If I already envisage, and if you see what has been prepared for the strategic agenda of the European Council, that is a Christmas tree. It is not identifying what are the most important, significant priorities we need to set. So my fear is that we will actually, at the European level, not do what is required to be done. And if you look into the reaction to yesterday's results in the member states, the debate is very different from the discussion we are having here. The debate is not about what are the implications for national European policy making or for European policy making. The discussion is about what does that mean for the government in Berlin? What does that mean now for the future of Macron? What does it mean for the chances of Le Pen becoming president? And I could go on. So everything also in terms of the reaction to yesterday's results to the elections is very national focused. Now you could say, well, that's normal. We've seen it also in the past, but we're not living in normal times. And if we accept that we're not living in normal times, the reaction being, what does it mean at the national level, is exactly not significant and not good enough. And actually, it is also backfiring at the end of the day at the national level, because those who we call as being the mainstream are getting even more under pressure because they will not be able to deliver, because delivery can not only happen at the national level, it has to happen also strongly at the European level. So we will be sitting here 5 years down the road, and what has been called the normalization of politics becoming more radical. And often we are probably discussing too much about the far right rather than being constructive about what the mainstream should be doing. But that in 5 years' time will have become even more normal, and that the realities of the world around us is being dominated by a discourse which is very far from how I understand the discourse should be and how I would set priorities. So there is a danger of us moving very slowly in the wrong direction. And that, I think, is being progressed through inertia. It's being progressed by not doing what we need to do at the European level. This is why I think it was a conscious wrong decision to not have an honest debate about the issues that also divide us within member states and between member states. And it was a conscious decision, as I said earlier, because many thought that if we would have an honest debate, we would also see what Fabian is alluding to, how much of trade-offs will be required to get things going. We have to take tough decisions about certain issues. There will be losers, there will be winners of change. We have to have that discussion. We're avoiding that discussion because we fear that if we have that discussion, we might have to admit how difficult these challenges are, and that we often will not be able to satisfactorily respond to that. And that is what the mainstream fears will play into the hands of the far right. That's why they're trying to avoid that debate. But I think over the mid to longer period, this will massively backfire if this is the logic we continue to adhere to.
So is the honest discussion the way to set those priorities for you? How would you do it, and what would you focus on? And can anything be done at this point, given that the campaign and the elections have been what they have been? Can anything be salvaged as we move into a new political institutional cycle?
Always things can be salvaged. And normatively, and I think Fabian would even say morally, we can discuss as to what needs to be done. And I think we would come to a conclusion in this room that there are certain areas which are more significant, which we need to concentrate on. We might also have differences, but I think that we would be able to define what needs to be done. But analytically, I don't see that this is what we're going to see happening. Ursula von der Leyen now has to put together a huge coalition. She will have to put in anything she can get from everywhere in order to make sure that she gets support from different corners of the mainstream European Parliament. So that's a compromise exercise. The European Council is also very diverse. It will have to be, and it will be, a compromise exercise in putting together the strategic agenda. And I could continue. So if you see analytica of what we're doing, it is muddling through, hopefully at least that we're going to have progress in muddling through, because there are different ways of muddling through. But in terms of the level of what we need to do analytically, I must say that unfortunately my hopes are rather low.
Catherine, Janis is saying that there's a lot of focus on political developments now and political earthquakes in France and Germany, perhaps for the right reason, which don't necessarily bode well for the future of European integration, but they do have an impact for the EU, do they? Do they not?
I think they have a huge impact on the EU. First of all, because we know that one of the reasons why we've been so slow in actually delivering the support for Ukraine at the right level is partly because of the dysfunctional relationship between France and Germany. So we've got both leaders who were already hemmed in, and to some extent, potentially Scholz more so than Macron. Now we have the two leaders at the heart of Europe that are weakened. Their legitimacy in some ways is weakened, and I think that that too is hugely problematic. I mean, I think Macron has, by calling these snap elections, he's taken a very big gamble. But I mean, I think it's risky. I don't think he will necessarily lose in that gamble. But I think we'll see how he comes out of it. He is betting in some respects, in the first instance, that in legislative elections, potentially the Rassemblement National doesn't do quite as well. He's also betting that if they do well, they don't get a majority, and therefore, even though they become part of government, they will struggle to govern. But of course, that's a very that in and of itself is yet another gamble. Gambling on poor government in order to disqualify the Rassemblement National in 2027. That could be strong medicine that in many respects kills the patient in the end. I just want to make one quick point, going back to something that was said about having an honest debate and actually telling people, voters, hard truths. You could argue that Macron, in his Europe speech, when he said that Europe was mortal and that it was a make or break moment, that to some extent he didn't particularly sugarcoat it, right? Now it comes with all sorts of caveats in terms of the political character that he is, and his own aspirations and his own strategies. But the fact is that to some extent you could say that he has been quite blunt, over the past few months, and where that's gotten him is with Jordan Bardella on 32%. So it's a question of saying these things, but it's also a question of saying these things in ways that people are willing to hear them. And I think that in that respect, we haven't got, the language to actually frame these trade-offs, frame these challenges in ways that go beyond scaring people. How do you strike that balance between a kind of a constructive challenge and simply scaring people to the extent that they then end up wanting to turn inward and vote for a Jordan Bardella. So I think he's a bit of a cautionary tale, Macron, in that respect.
Right. Maybe I'll stop here with the panel discussion because I want to give you the opportunity to come in as well with any questions or comments. I can see, we'll collect a few questions. Just briefly introduce yourself. I wonder if we have some help with the microphones. There's one. Yeah. Can you please raise your hand again so they see you? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I'm a little surprised you have not mentioned any sort of a major blunder by that commission in the last 5 years, because if not, there wouldn't be such a public sentiment turning to the far right. I mean, you cannot just dismiss them as being misled by misinformation. For example, the living cost crisis, the top concern. The second, to me, Europe seems to be normalizing this Ukraine-Russian conflict. Everybody supposed it would end by the end of 2022, but now it seems going forever. Macron, at the beginning, want to approach to Russia, but he was attacked for appeasement. Now he become the hawk, want to sending troops to Russia. So I don't know. Are you seriously not thinking there was a major mistake by Ursula von der Leyen administration? Thank you.
Right, thank you. I have another question up front here. Did you introduce yourself, sir? Okay.
So yes, thank you very much. I'm Isabel Montoya from the European Parliament, and I would be, some of you mentioned it briefly, the impact. I would like to know about what you think of the impact of these results on two policy fields, the Green Deal and trade agreements or international agreements. Thank you very much.
Right. Do we have a third comment or question? Okay, we have. All right.
Robert Kesic, Ambassador and Head of Mission of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the EU. Obviously, I'm going to ask you about expanding the EU. How does this election impact the aspirations of candidate countries and the prospects that integration can be achieved?
Well, since this kind of falls into the same category of policy impact, then maybe I'll take a third, an additional question. Yes, okay. I'll come to you, sir. Yes.
Hi, my name's Finlay Sweetenham. I'm working at the Scottish Government in the EU. I'm wondering what these results mean for the EU's willingness to engage with third countries, specifically the UK. We've sort of seen a more beneficial relationship for both sides in recent times, and with the potential of an incoming Labour government in the UK, there's signs that they'll be willing to engage with the EU further. And I'm wondering if this sort of rightward shift will impact that negatively in any way. Thank you.
Okay, I'll collect a few, the remaining questions in a second round. UK was mentioned, so maybe we'll start from the last question, and I'll come to Fabian because I haven't given you the chance to react before I turn to the audience.
Thank you, Corina. Well, I'll start with the UK then. I think the more significant impact of the relationship of the EU and the UK will be the new Labour government, and it will be a Labour government. There is nothing the Tories can do to change that. I think that opens up some possibilities. However, it is far from clear what the Starmer government is actually wanting to achieve with the European Union. So it remains to be seen whether it really is a significant shift. I think the one area where there is potentially constructive cooperation, at least at the outset, is security and defense. I don't think very much will change on the economic relationship, but we will see how willing the UK is to also overcome some of the taboos which have been created over the last years. I think on some of the other issues, I just wanted to emphasize one thing. It's not necessarily only about what are the priorities we have. I think in many areas it's actually the how which is more important than the what. We can very easily agree on some very broad priorities. I'm not saying that everyone agrees on those, but I think broadly speaking, there's an agreement. But when you then come to how do we translate that into practice, what are the trade-offs we're going to make, where's the money going to come from, that's when the disagreement starts. So this is as much about defining what are the instruments we have and how are we going to use them. And that's where we're actually seeing that the debate is not constructive, is not in agreement. When you talk to people behind closed doors about, for example, the next multi-annual financial framework, it's a disaster. It is completely ignoring the realities which we are facing because people, again, do not want to engage with that. Now, when it comes to, and I want to be very direct and open about that, when it comes to the war of Russia against Ukraine, this is a war against Europe. And we didn't do enough to tell citizens that this was what is at stake. Because citizens have to understand that it is our security, our immediate security, which is under threat. And if they understand that, they will also be willing to do a lot more than they have done up to now. Now, that's not a comfortable message. It's not a nice thing to have to say to people. Nobody wants a war, but the reality is we have an aggressor at our border. And unless we help Ukraine to defend us, we are all going to be in peril in a very short time. So this is a reality. This is exactly the kind of reality I was talking about, which we have to communicate much more clearly. And we failed to do that beforehand. And that also means that when it comes to some of the other policy areas, we have to be honest and say, we won't have money for everything. We have to tell people that this is also meaning that we will have to make sacrifices. In some countries in Europe, they have had to put up taxes to pay for more defense. Now, that's not popular, but that is the reality in which we're living. What will it mean for issues like the Green Deal? I'm afraid we are going to see a slowdown in implementation. We're not going to talk about it very much because nobody wants to emphasize that. But I think it will be a much slower process than otherwise envisaged, because at this stage, it is now down to member states implementing what was agreed. So we'll see that there isn't going to be that much pressure as before, and we'll just quietly move on. And there will always be the reference to the global environment, which is far too difficult. Enlargement, I should ask Corina, but just to say, I think we have made a lot of implicit promises. I have yet to see that we're actually doing what is necessary to fulfill those promises.
Catherine, I come to you. If you want to cherry pick among the questions that have been posed.
Yeah, no, I was simply going to add a point to the Green Deal and trade agreements question, which is that the fact that this is going to be slower and that large trade agreements are going to be more difficult, it has already started. And this isn't about the presence of the far right or the radical right. This is also a much more widespread backlash, I think, against these areas. And then I think that, you know, the point about there there being a trade-off between certain policy decisions. Can you increase defense, and can you actually implement the Green Deal? And if you can't do them simultaneously, how do you raise the money? Which taxes do you put up? Who puts up the taxes? Do you do more joint borrowing? All of this, I think this is the crucial discussion that we need to have, because it's not about whether or not we do one or the other. It's that we are faced with these challenges, and we need to find a way to have the conversation where the trade-offs are made explicit. Again, I go back to this idea, though, is that how you make those trade-offs explicit, the words you use, the frames, the narratives you use is incredibly important, because it can go horribly wrong. It can just generate a backlash, as we've seen.
May I ask you, because you have a very interesting argument regarding how to fight populism, and it's about pulling a Sujitsu strategy on that. And would language amount to that strategy in this case, in your opinion? What or what else would?
Well, I mean, I think language isn't everything, but when you see certain leaders actually motivated very much by the desire to to enter into a conversation, to create a debate and a playing field where these discussions are had, but they use a language that is really conducive to fear and backtracking from the voters, then obviously we have to focus on that. And the reason I talk about a jujitsu move is that I think that we are too timid. We may not do it right, but we are too timid in the way that we frame these challenges. The radical right, the populists, are not timid in the accusations they made, and we pull our punches. So we mustn't do that, but we must find a way to do it that is more constructive and inclusive. Otherwise, all we get is more polarization.
Thank you, Catherine. And Janis, is an honest debate also admitting to the blunders? Just to come back to some of the questions.
Yes, it is also admitting to the blunders, also admitting to the fact that also among the EU 27, and I also include individual member states, a lot of mistakes have been committed. So if you actually want to have an honest debate, you need to put the mirror in front of yourself and also be self-critical in terms of what you have done wrong, collectively and individually. And by the way, it's not only about having an honest debate, it's also about seeing the honest debate as the basis to have a real conversation and also a political contest about what needs to be done at the national and at the European level. For me, the honest debate is just a start. It's not the end point. If it's the end point, you would really have the danger of creating a situation where you even strengthen those who you want to counter in the political contest. When it comes to the blunders, you need to openly discuss them. You need to mention them. And we do that, by the way. You also need to highlight who is responsible for certain non-delivery at the European level. So it's not as easy to say it is one person or one institution. It's the system also which has a fault. And often it is national capitals which need to be made responsible. But if you analytically look into the results and ask yourselves, why do the AfD do well? Why did the RN do well? Why do the FPÖ do well in Austria? If you ask these questions, I do not think that the first response you will get from voters is because the Commission did not deliver. There are other reasons they will mention to you. Then you need to make the connection as to why at national level you do not deliver, because you can't. You need the European cooperation, which means you need to have a much higher level of cooperation, maybe even integration at the European level. And that is also part of the honest debate, but we're not having that. And with respect to enlargement, enlargement needs a high level of political will and courage to get it through. And unfortunately, following also the discussion we had today, the results of the European elections do not strengthen the ability and the willingness at the national level to invest political capital into making sure that what many of us in this room probably consider a geopolitical imperative to actually deliver when it comes to the promises which Fabian already alluded towards when it comes to enlargement, I don't think that when it comes to political will encourage the result of the past days of the EP election is really helpful, which means you need even more political leadership. And the question is, where does that come from?
Okay, we started a bit late, so I want to ask you a 30-second question per person before we conclude. But I do feel bad about the one hand that was up and I didn't allow to come in. It's already been answered. Okay. Okay, so in that case, for a very quick wrap up, if you can tell me, each of you, one hope or one recommendation that you would have for the next parliament as it prepares to start its mandate. Fabian, maybe we start from you.
But asking me about hope.
Yes.
Look, what I really hope, and I'm not sure it's the parliament, I hope collectively that we start the process of this strategic thinking, of having a real discussion about the priorities which we have to have and how we're going to deliver them, including the difficult choices, the trade-offs we've talked about. And that discussion has to take place across borders, because the problems we are facing are not confined by national borders.
Janis?
I would not avoid your question. So recommendation for the European Parliament, looking back over the past 10 years, in 2014, the European Parliament did position itself rather well after the European Parliament election, had a decisive and a unified voice, also when it comes to the presidency of the European Commission. That I think was an element of strength for the European Parliament. In 2019, we saw exactly the opposite, the European Parliament not being able to get its act together to support a clear position with respect to key decisions which had to be taken in the early moments of the mandate. I think that further weakened the European Parliament. So my recommendation for this Parliament is get your act together, form a coalition of the mainstream, and when it comes to the first decisions that need to be made, which relates to the Commission President-elect, have a unified position of that majority of who you support.
And Catherine, last but not least.
I think that, much of the hopes have been well verbalized already, but, at the risk of being a bit passé, I would still push for more work so that by the next election, we have transnational lists.
Thank you very much. 3 very different and concrete suggestions. We can only hope that the new leadership is listening and will act on them. Thank you for your participation. Please join me in thanking our speakers for their input. And it's a wrap.